The first sign that something was wrong with my parents came in the form of silence. I used to come home from school to the sound of my mother humming in the kitchen and my father clattering tools in the garage. They weren't overly affectionate, but their presence was warm, steady, and dependable. But one day, the house fell into a quiet that pressed against my chest like a weight. "Mom? Dad," I called, stepping into the foyer. The house smelled damp, like soil overturned after a rain. It was strange, considering it hadn't rained in days. I found my mother in the kitchen standing at the sink. She didn't turn when I entered, even though she must have heard me. Her hands were submerged in soapy water, but she wasn't washing anything. She just stared out the window, her body as still as a statue. "Mom?" I said again, louder this time. She turned her head slowly, her movements jerky, almost mechanical. Her lips parted, but no words came out, just a faint rasp. Then she smiled, a tight, stretched thing that didn't reach her eyes. "Dinner's at 6, she said in a flat voice and turned back to the sink. I backed out of the room, heart thudding. Something about her felt wrong, like she was wearing a mask of herself. That night, I noticed my father sitting in his chair, staring at the blank television screen. The remote rested on the armrest untouched. He didn't even look up when I walked past. "Dad?" I ventured. He turned his head sharply, his eyes bloodshot and glassy. "Bedtime soon," he murmured, then turned back to the dark screen. The way his body sagged, it was as if something had drained the life out of him. Over the next few days, their behavior only got stranger. They stopped talking to each other entirely, communicating only in cryptic, monotone phrases when necessary. They moved slower, like they were wading through molasses. My mother began rearranging the kitchen cabinets in the middle of the night, shuffling plates and cups in an endless loop. My father took to standing in the backyard, staring up at the moon for hours without moving. And then came the sound. It started one evening as I was lying in bed. A low, guttural humming vibrated through the walls. At first, I thought it was coming from the pipes, but as I pressed my ear to the floorboards, I realized it was coming from below, from the basement. I'd always been afraid of the basement. It was dark and musty, filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture. But that night, the hum pulled at me, a magnetic force I couldn't resist. I grabbed my phone for light and crept downstairs, each step creaking louder than the last. The basement door was ajar and the hum grew louder as I descended. It wasn't just a noise, it was a vibration that thrummed in my bones. When I reached the bottom, I saw them. My parents were standing in the center of the room, their backs to me, their heads tilted upward, mouths hanging open. The hum was coming from them, their throats vibrating like tuning forks. "Mom? Dad?" I whispered, my voice trembling. They turned in unison, their movements unnaturally synchronized. Their eyes had turned an inky black, and their mouths stretched into wide, unnatural grins. The hum ceased, replaced by a guttural clicking noise that made my skin crawl. "Time to sleep," my mother said, her voice layered with an echo that didn't belong to her. "Time to sleep," my father repeated, his grin widening. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. Without thinking, I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and pressed my ear against the wood, listening. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the clicking started again, growing louder and faster like insects skittering across the floor. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I barricaded myself in my room, pushing my dresser against the door. I tried calling friends, the police, anyone who might help, but my phone refused to connect. It was as if the house itself had swallowed the signal. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet again. When I ventured downstairs, I found my parents sitting at the dining table, eating breakfast as if nothing had happened. Their eyes were normal again, their movements fluid. They even smiled at me, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like they were mimicking something they'd forgotten how to do. "Good morning, sweetheart," my mother said cheerfully, sliding a plate of eggs toward me. Her voice sounded more natural, but there was still a hollow undertone I couldn't ignore. I didn't eat. I couldn't. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Over the next few days, their behavior became increasingly erratic. My mother started collecting dirt, pouring it into bowls she placed around the house. My father began tearing up the floorboards in the living room, muttering about making space. One night, I woke to find them standing at the foot of my bed. Their faces were blank, their eyes once again that endless black. "It's time," my father said. "Time to join us," my mother added. I screamed and scrambled backward, but they lunged, their arms elongating unnaturally, fingers curling into claws. I kicked and fought, managing to slip past them and out the door. I ran through the house, their guttural clicking echoing behind me. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thick and suffocating. I made it outside and sprinted into the woods, not daring to look back. The clicking followed me, growing louder and more frantic. Then, just as I thought they'd catch me, the noise stopped. I turned to see them standing at the edge of the trees, their black eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They didn't cross the threshold, as if something held them back. For now. I've been staying with a friend in another town, trying to figure out what to do. But every night, I hear that low hum, faint but unmistakable. It's getting closer. There was a legend in the small, fog-shrouded town of Greystone. In the heart of the sprawling marketplace, amidst the vibrant booths of fruit sellers, artisans, and spice merchants, stood an unassuming wooden stall. It bore no sign, no decorations, and sold nothing. Yet, it appeared year after year during the annual Moonlight Fair, a tradition that had spanned over a century. Locals referred to it as the Shadow Stall. For years, whispers circulated about people who had entered the stall and never returned. The rumors began decades ago, with tales of travelers, outsiders, and even some locals vanishing without a trace. But the stories were always brushed aside as ghost tales until last year when Claire Hadley, a curious college student visiting her grandmother in Greystone, went missing. Her disappearance left the town shaken, and the stall's eerie reputation was sealed. Despite this, the Moonlight Fair continued, and so did the Shadow Stall. It always appeared overnight, its warped wooden panels glistening with dew in the morning light, as if it had sprouted from the cobblestones themselves. No one ever saw it being constructed, nor did anyone witness anyone tending to it. This year, however, the townsfolk were restless. The fairgrounds buzzed with apprehension as people murmured about Claire, about the others who had vanished. Some parents refused to let their children roam too far, while others cast wary glances at the stall and made the sign of the cross as they walked by. But for 18-year-old Ethan Moore, the stall was a puzzle he was determined to solve. Claire had been his best friend, and he refused to believe she was simply gone. He had spent the last year obsessing over the legends, poring over old newspapers, and interviewing anyone who claimed to know about the disappearances. All the stories pointed back to the same conclusion. The Shadow Stall was the epicenter of the mystery. The night of the Moonlight Fair arrived, the air filled with the sweet scent of candied apples and roasted chestnuts. The fairgrounds' lanterns cast a golden glow over the throngs of visitors. Ethan stood near the stall, his heart pounding as he observed it. Tonight, he thought, he would get his answers. The stall itself was as unsettling as ever. Its blackened wood seemed to absorb the light around it, and the faint scent of damp earth wafted from within. The entrance was veiled with a tattered black curtain, which swayed gently despite the still air. Ethan's plan was simple. He'd enter the stall, see what was inside, and figure out how it was connected to the disappearances. Armed with his phone's flashlight and a small folding knife, he waited until the crowd thinned, then stepped forward. As he pushed aside the curtain, a chill ran down his spine. The interior of the stall was far larger than it appeared from the outside. The walls stretched endlessly, lined with towering shelves, filled with strange objects. Dusty jars filled with unidentifiable substances, yellowed books with spines written in languages he didn't recognize, and peculiar trinkets that seemed to hum faintly when he passed. The air was thick and cold, and his breath formed misty clouds in front of him. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. There was no response. He walked further in, his footsteps muffled by the strange, spongy floor. The farther he went, the darker it became, until the light from his phone was swallowed by the gloom. Suddenly, a low whisper reached his ears. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, more insistent. Ethan spun around, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural voice. "You should not have come here." Ethan's heart raced as he turned toward the source of the voice. A figure emerged from the darkness, its shape shifting and flickering like a shadow cast by a dying flame. It had no discernible features, only a pair of glowing, ember-like eyes that bore into his soul. "Where is Claire?" Ethan shouted, gripping his knife tightly. The shadow figure tilted its head as if amused. "She is here, they are all here, and now you will join them." Before Ethan could react, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around him like tendrils of smoke. He struggled, slashing at the darkness, but his knife passed through it as though it were air. The whispers returned, louder now, like a cacophony of voices crying out in anguish. He was pulled deeper into the stall, the walls closing in around him. The shelves and their strange contents blurred into a vortex of darkness, and the cold seeped into his bones. Just as he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness, he caught a glimpse of a figure in the distance. It was Claire. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, and she reached out to him, mouthing a single word: "Run." With a surge of adrenaline, Ethan broke free from the shadowy tendrils and sprinted toward the faint light of the entrance. The whispers screamed in protest, but he didn't look back. Bursting through the curtain, he stumbled into the fairground, collapsing onto the cobblestones. When he turned around, the stall was gone. In its place was an empty patch of ground, as though it had never been there. The fair continued around him, oblivious to what had happened. Ethan tried to warn the townsfolk, but few believed him. Those who did whispered that he had been marked by the stall and that it would return for him one day, but Ethan didn't care. He knew the truth, and he knew Claire was still in there, trapped with the others. As the years passed, Ethan dedicated his life to uncovering the secrets of the Shadow Stall. But every moonlight fair, when the fog rolled in and the lanterns lit up the night, he stayed far away from the marketplace, knowing that the stall was still out there, waiting. And it always would be. It started with a wrong turn. Anna had lived in the town of Willowbrook her entire life. She knew its streets like the back of her hand, or at least she thought she did. On a chilly October evening, she left her friend Maggie's house a little later than planned. The sun had set hours ago, and a dense fog rolled in, blurring the familiar landmarks of her small town. As she drove, Anna noticed the road stretching farther than it should. The turn from Maple Avenue never appeared. Instead, her headlights illuminated an unfamiliar sign: Hollow Pine Lane. Anna frowned. There was no Hollow Pine Lane in Willowbrook. She was certain of it. She slowed down, unsure of what she'd stumbled upon. The street was narrow, flanked by old, gnarled trees that seemed to lean in, their skeletal branches scraping at her car like claws. Against her better judgment, she decided to keep driving, hoping the street would loop back to something she recognized. The houses lining Hollow Pine Lane were unsettling. Unlike the cozy suburban homes in Willowbrook, these were decrepit, Victorian-era relics. Most had boarded-up windows, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Others were shrouded in darkness, their overgrown lawns crawling with ivy. A single street lamp buzzed weakly, casting long, twitching shadows. Anna glanced at her phone to check the map, but it refused to load. No signal. Her chest tightened as a knot of unease twisted in her stomach. She kept driving, her eyes darting from the foggy windshield to the eerie silhouettes of the houses. The first sign of trouble came when she noticed the silence. No crickets chirped, no distant hum of cars on nearby roads. It was as if the world beyond Horrifying Lane no longer existed. Then she saw the woman. A pale figure stood motionless on the sidewalk, her back to Anna. She wore a tattered white dress, its hem frayed and muddy. Her long, black hair hung limp, hiding her face. Anna's hands tightened on the wheel. The woman didn't move as Anna's car crept closer. When she was nearly parallel to the figure, the woman suddenly turned her head. Her face was wrong, pale and featureless, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. A grin stretched impossibly wide across her face, revealing jagged yellow teeth. Anna screamed and slammed on the gas, her tires squealing on the wet pavement. In her rearview mirror, the woman was gone, but her relief was short-lived. The street didn't end. No matter how far she drove, Horrifying Lane stretched endlessly ahead, the same crumbling houses, the same buzzing street lamp. Panic clawed at her as she realized she wasn't alone anymore. Shapes began to emerge from the fog, figures like the woman she'd seen earlier. They stood along the sidewalks, motionless and staring, their blank faces turned toward her car, their mouths stretched into identical, grotesque grins. Anna's breathing grew ragged. She tried to turn the car around, but the road seemed impossibly narrow, the trees pressing closer than before. When she risked a glance in the rearview mirror, her blood ran cold. The figures were following her now, their movements slow and jerky, as if their limbs didn't quite work the way they should. She pressed harder on the gas, but the road seemed to resist her, her car struggling as if the pavement itself clung to her tires. The houses became more dilapidated, their windows like black eyes watching her. A chill seeped into the car, frosting the inside of the windows. Then she saw it. A house that hadn't been there before. It was larger than the others, looming at the end of the street like a predator lying in wait. Its front door was wide open, a rectangle of impenetrable darkness beckoning her. Anna's headlights flickered as she approached, and the car sputtered, coming to a shuddering halt. "No, no, no," she cried, fumbling with the keys, but the engine refused to start. The figures were closer now, their unnatural movements bringing them within feet of her car. Anna grabbed her phone, desperate for help, but the screen was still blank. A sharp knock on the driver's side window made her jump. She turned her head slowly, dread pooling in her gut. One of the figures stood there, its blank face inches from the glass. It raised a hand and pointed toward the house. "No," Anna whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not going in there." The figure's grin widened impossibly, splitting its face in two. The others joined it, surrounding her car, their skeletal fingers tapping against the windows in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap. The pressure became unbearable. Anna bolted from the car, her legs carrying her toward the house before she even realized what she was doing. The figures didn't follow. They stood in a silent circle around her car, their blank faces turned toward her as she crossed the threshold into the darkness. Inside, the air was heavy and cold, thick with the scent of mildew. The door slammed shut behind her, and Anna spun around, her heart pounding. She tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "Hello?" Her voice quivered, echoing through the empty house. A faint sound drifted down from the second floor, a soft, melodic humming. Against every instinct, Anna found herself climbing the staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight. The humming grew louder, more distorted, as if a chorus of voices was singing out of sync. At the top of the stairs, she found a single door slightly ajar. A dim, flickering light spilled from the crack. Her trembling hand pushed it open. The room was empty, save for a mirror hanging on the far wall. The glass was foggy, and as Anna stepped closer, her reflection began to change. Her own face faded, replaced by that of the grinning woman she'd seen on the street. Anna stumbled back, but her reflection didn't move. It grinned wider, lifting a hand to wave. The figures began to appear in the mirror behind her, filling the room. Their grins stretched wider and wider until their faces split apart, revealing gaping black voids. Anna screamed as the mirror shattered and the darkness swallowed her whole. The next morning, Anna's car was found abandoned on the edge of Willowbrook. Her friends and family searched for her, but there was no trace of Horrifying Lane. To this day, locals whisper about the street that doesn't exist, warning anyone who gets lost in the fog to turn back before it's too late. Because if you find yourself on Horrifying Lane, you may never leave. It was a moonless night, and the air hung thick with an unsettling quiet. Laura was driving alone on Route 66, the infamous stretch of highway known among locals as the Wraith's Road. She'd heard the rumors, the whispers of disappearances, the stories of headlights appearing in your rearview mirror only to vanish when you turn to look. She dismissed the tales as urban legends, the kind of campfire fodder that got retold with exaggerated twists. But as the road stretched before her, swallowed by the oppressive darkness, she felt a weight settle in her chest. The trees lining the highway loomed like shadowy sentinels, their gnarled branches stretching overhead, forming an ominous archway. Her gas tank was nearly full, and she'd made sure to pack a flashlight and snacks. What could possibly go wrong? The first hour of the drive passed uneventfully, but as Laura glanced at the clock, she realized it had been stuck at 11:57 for what felt like forever. She tapped it lightly, frowning when it didn't budge. Suddenly, her radio crackled to life. It wasn't music or static, it was a voice. "Turn back," the voice hissed, barely a whisper over the crackle. Laura's heart leapt into her throat. She twisted the knob, switching to another station, but the voice remained. "You don't belong here. Turn back now." Slamming the radio off, she focused on the road. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel, her foot pressing down harder on the gas pedal. She convinced herself it was just interference, a prank broadcast, or some old ham radio bleeding into the frequency. A figure appeared on the roadside ahead, illuminated briefly by her headlights. A man, his thumb extended in the universal sign of a hitchhiker. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face obscured by shadow. Instinct told her to keep driving, but guilt made her slow down. "Are you lost?" she called out, rolling the window down just a crack. The man stepped closer. His face came into view, and Laura's stomach churned. His eyes were hollow sockets, empty and black. His grin stretched too wide, teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. "Take me with you," he rasped. Panicked, Laura slammed her foot on the accelerator, the tires screeching as she sped away. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man standing motionless in the middle of the road, his empty eyes staring after her. Laura's breath came in shallow gasps as she drove faster, the speedometer needle creeping toward dangerous territory. But no matter how far she went, the scenery didn't change. The same trees, the same curve in the road, the same battered highway signs appeared over and over again. Her phone had no signal, and the GPS was frozen on an error screen. She should have reached the next town by now, but the highway stretched endlessly into the void. And then the headlights appeared. At first, they were distant, tiny pinpricks of light in her rearview mirror, but they grew closer, brighter, until they were blinding. The vehicle behind her wasn't a car. It was a massive black semi-truck with no driver visible behind the wheel. Its engine roared, the sound deafening as it bore down on her. She swerved to the side, her tires skidding on the loose gravel, but the truck followed, relentless. Its horn blared, a deep, guttural sound that rattled her bones. "Get away," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. She veered off the road and into the forest, her car bumping and jolting as it tore through the underbrush. The truck didn't follow, but its horn echoed in the distance, a haunting reminder that it was still out there. Emerging from the trees, Laura found herself in a small, desolate town. The buildings were crumbling, Their windows shattered. A rusted gas station sign swayed in the breeze, its fluorescent bulbs flickering weakly. Her car sputtered to a stop. The engine was dead, and no amount of turning the key could bring it back to life. With no other options, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped out. The air was heavy, thick, with a stench of decay. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. A faint sound reached her ears, a low, rhythmic scraping, like metal dragging against asphalt. It grew louder, closer, until she saw its source. A figure emerged from the shadows, dragging a rusted scythe behind it. It was the hitchhiker. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Laura turned and ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. She darted into an alley, her pulse pounding in her ears. The scraping sound followed, unhurried but relentless. She stumbled into the gas station, slamming the door behind her. The room was empty except for an old payphone mounted on the wall. To her astonishment, it worked. "Please," she sobbed into the receiver. "I'm trapped on Route 66. I need help." The voice on the other end was cold, flat. "You've already been helped. You never should have left the road." The line went dead. The door creaked open behind her. She turned to see the hitchhiker standing in the doorway, his scythe glinting in the dim light. "You can't leave," he said, his hollow sockets fixed on her. Laura backed away, her heart racing. "What do you want from me?" He grinned that impossibly wide grin. "You're part of the road now." The room dissolved into darkness, and Laura's screams echoed into nothingness. Days later, a trucker spotted her car abandoned on the side of Route 66. There was no sign of Laura, but locals say if you drive that highway on a moonless night, you might see a woman standing by the roadside, her thumb outstretched, her eyes hollow and black. "If you're foolish enough to stop, you'll never leave the highway again,"